Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a bit of a different video on the channel. So what I'm going to be doing here is basically an in-depth analysis of the current historic best of 3 metagame, because we've obviously got the play-ins, the Mythic Qualifier, and the Arena Championship coming up, and I've had quite a few new people to the channel who are interested in historic because of the upcoming events, and also I'm in kind of a weird spot to do with content right now because we're obviously coming up to the end of the ladder season, and it's really important for me that I finish top 250 because the next qualifier is historic, which I'm really interested in playing in, obviously. And so I basically stopped playing ladder. I'm camping on my rank right now because I don't really want to risk playing and then falling out of the top 250, especially if I'm recording content with decks that I don't think are that great, if that makes sense. And then secondly, I also want to keep most of the brews that I'm really excited for the qualifier under wraps as well. I do want to get a competitive advantage. Some of the lists that I'm working on, I'm also working on with other people that also want to keep it under wraps as well. So I will be putting out videos of decks I've been working on that I probably won't run in the qualifier, but are still very good if you're interested in checking that out. But again, I don't really want to play on the ladder right now because I don't want to risk falling out of the top 250. So I was considering recording some best of 3 historic events, but I haven't played the events in ages, and my experience has been really bad with them recently. It takes me often 5 minutes to connect to a game, and then, you know, half the decks I'm playing are absolute jank, and then the other half people are making tons of misplays. So I didn't think that was particularly good content. So especially with the influx of new people to the channel who are interested in historic, I thought it would just be a good idea to just do a general overview, look at the expected top decks, how to beat them, how they change and how the metagame changes with the food chain ban, you know, good sideboard cards, and a look at some of the more fringe decks and what I think of them and their positioning as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by looking at what I think the top 4 decks are going into this event. So prior to the food chain ban, in my opinion, the top 5 decks, or the main 5 decks in the format, were Mardu Goyfs, Dimir Frog, food chain obviously, Affinity and Auras. So obviously with food chain being banned, I'm not going to be talking about that. I will be mainly focusing at the start of the video on the other 4 decks that I mentioned, Jund, Dimir, Affinity and Auras, talking about how the deck works, their strengths, their weaknesses, sideboard cards that are good against them, decks that are positioned well and poorly against them. And then after that, I'm going to be looking at some other decks that I've seen quite a lot of recently as well, basically just using all of the publicly available information. Unfortunately for you guys, I'm not going to reveal the decks that I'm working on at the moment, you know, brews that aren't really on people's radar for the historic qualifier, because like I said, I want to keep them under wraps. But hopefully this will give you a good overview of how to approach the format if you're new to it, and potential ways to tweak your lists if you are playing one of the decks that I mentioned as well. So the first list that I want to talk about here is Mardu Goyfs, which in my opinion is the best mid-range deck in the format and is one of the most generically powerful decks that is commonly seeing play right now as well. This list here is from Käpälä. I have a link down to all of the decks that I show in the description if you want to check them out. Not saying that this is 100% the best way to build the deck. My build, for example, is a fair bit different to this, but I'm still considering playing Gen for the qualifier, so I'm keeping that list under wraps until I choose 100% to pick something else, in which case I'll make a deck guide video on it. But basically this deck is a lot of generically powerful interaction and threats. We have early discard spells in Inquisition and Thoughtseize, early removal in Fatal Push and Abrupt Decay. Pyrogoyf also counts as extra interaction. You got Jarsil, which is probably the most generically powerful card in the deck, allowing you to reuse your interaction and then your 2-drops like Rumble and stuff. And then the Goyfs are kind of the real stars of the show. Barrow-Goyf really snowballs the game if the opponent can't kill it. You know, the lifelink is absolutely huge at ensuring you consistently have a good matchup against most of the aggressive decks. And then Pyrogoyf is the main way that you close the game out. This can obviously be used to take out creatures and planeswalkers if you need to stabilize early in the game, but then once you can get this down, especially in multiples, or if you start casting Barrow-Goyfs afterwards, you can just start doming the opponent to give you good reach to close the game out, even if you can't attack him for lethal, if that makes sense. So the really great thing about this deck is it's very generically powerful, and it has very good flexibility in terms of the options that you have for interaction as well, which is very good. So in terms of the way that this list has changed with the food chain ban, I think the biggest positive for Jund is just that you now can be way more flexible with your interaction. My Jund lists prior to the food chain ban were running 4 Thoughtseize, 4 Inquisition, which I really felt was a must because otherwise you can get shut off. Sorry, it allows the opponent to potentially combo off on turn 2 if you don't have a turn 1 discard spell. Now, obviously, with food chain not being around, you can go back to stuff like 4 Thoughtseize, 2 Inquisition. You don't really need to max out on that anymore. And then secondly, I was also maxing out on Abrupt Decay in the main deck. There are still good reasons to main deck for Abrupt Decay if you wanted to. It really gives you good matchups against Dimir, consistently enabling you to kill their threats even if they're holding up counter spells. It's very good against non-creature permanents like Birthing Ritual and especially Rest in Peace post-sideboard that I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. And it's obviously good against auras, enabling you to kill creatures through Sheltered by Ghosts because you don't have to pay for the ward tax. But again, there are some matchups where Abrupt Decay isn't that great. So again, not having to main deck 4 because of Food Chain enables you to run more generically powerful cards like Fear of Missing Out that just makes your proactive game plan a little bit stronger. And then additionally, it obviously means that you don't have to run dedicated sideboard cards for it as well. You know, I was running stuff like Disruptor Flute, trying Haywire Might and stuff like that as well. Now with Food Chain out of the metagame, you can now focus more on other matchups, which is a really big deal for a mid-range deck, right? Mid-range decks typically value their sideboard way more because you're going to be pivoting a lot pre and post sideboard. So in terms of what the deck is good against, honestly, it's good against basically all of the aggro and combo decks in the format because you have so much interaction, good ways to reuse it. Pyrogoyf, your main top-end threat, also doubles up as creature removal, so it's very good against aggressive decks like Auras and Wizards, for example, and because of the discard spells, it's also pretty good against most combo decks as well, so you're good against a lot of the format in terms of that sense. The format has become a lot more grindy and interactive as well, and having discard spells also is a really good tool in the counterspell matchups. Dimir Frog is the main one, but I have also seen an uptick in Azorius and Jeskai Control recently as well, so having 1-mana discard spells gives you an edge against those sorts of decks because typically discard spells are better against counter spells, if that makes sense. In terms of what it's bad against, I do think that the biggest negative effect of the Food Chain ban on Jund is that proactive decks that aren't as interactive but have a lot of value 2-for-1s, decks like Devotion, decks like Eldrazi, decks like Badgermole Cub, I think will become more popular now because their biggest issue, if we look at Devotion for example, the only real interaction that deck has is going Karn minus to grab something which is very slow, meaning that Devotion basically has a terrible matchup against Food Chain if they can consistently get their combo off early. Same sort of thing with Eldrazi, same sort of thing with the Badgermole Cub ramp decks, and also Affinity as well. That's another deck I'm going to be talking about. That's another deck that doesn't have too much interaction in the main deck. They mainly rely on counterspells like Metallic Rebuke, sometimes creature removal in the form of Aether Spellbomb, and Galvanic Blast, I mean. But outside of that, those decks are full of 2-for-1s, full of good value cards, meaning that, you know, the big weakness of discard spell decks in general is that you're not very good at stopping stuff that the opponent draws off the top, and all those decks have cards that can snowball the game really quickly, provide immediate 2-for-1s. You know, in the form of Devotion, they have Outcast the Liberator, Kiora, cards that can just start drawing them a bunch. Against Eldrazi, they have Kozilek's Command. All of their top-end Eldrazi mostly have cast triggers, enabling them to be 2-for-1s. And then obviously Affinity is full of cards that can draw you through your deck very easily. Drix Interlacer, the new Krang, Thoughtcast, Thought Monitor, loads of options for them to get back in the game off the top of the deck as well. So I think those sorts of decks that were pretty poorly positioned into Food Chain beforehand because they didn't run too much interaction to stop Food Chain itself now become a lot more viable and become better positioned because the format is quite grindy as well. So that's the biggest issue with the Food Chain ban for me. Decks like Devotion, Affinity, Eldrazi become better positioned, which are all relatively tricky matchups for Jund, if that makes sense. Then in terms of sideboard cards that are also good against Jund, the main one that we're going to be talking about here is Rest in Peace. I think Rest in Peace is by far and away the best sideboard card against Jund because it just shuts off so much of the proactive plan of the deck. Exiling the entire graveyard shuts off Pyrogoyf, Barrogoyf, Jar, Sul, Croxer, Fear of Missing Out, Detectives, Phoenix, and that's basically the entire deck. Now obviously you do have Abrupt Decay. This is another reason why I'm still considering running Abrupt Decay in the main deck in higher numbers, especially post-sideboard. You do also have Culling Ritual, which gives you another out to it, if that makes sense. But Rest in Peace is by far and away the best sideboard card. So if you are running a deck that really struggles into Jund, if you're in white and your proactive game plan doesn't get hosed by it, I would strongly consider running Rest in Peace. And also, if you're not too worried about Harbinger of the Seas, you could consider splashing white in your deck if you're naturally weak to Jund and you want to improve the matchup, because this definitely feels like the trump card against Jund, right? It will just shut off so much of their proactive game plan, and if they don't have an immediate Abrupt Decay or a way to answer it, it becomes really difficult for the opponent to recover from it as well. So that's the best way to approach it in terms of sideboarding. Then in terms of some other decks that I think are naturally good against Jund, I think Mardu Goyfs, which is a similar core package to what this deck is running, but you run white instead of green, mainly to give you access to the Overlord of the Belmurk, dedicated Dollmaker Felia package. I feel like that deck has a naturally good matchup against Jund. Now I do think it's slower and has deck building issues against the rest of the field that I'll talk about a little bit later. I'm going to talk specifically about those sorts of decks later in the video, but Overlord of the Belmurk specifically is so difficult for Jund to beat. It repeatedly gets back creatures that the opponent is going to be killing. It's very difficult for them to kill itself, because if you have a look at the interaction in Käpälä's list, for example, Grist and Haywire Might are the only real ways they have of removing them, and Might only works if you kill the Overlord before it gets blinked. So unless the opponent is running stuff like Terminate or, you know, generic interaction instead of Abrupt Decay and Fatal Push, then Overlord of the Belmurk is really difficult for them to beat as well. So that deck is naturally good against Jund. Izzet Phoenix has felt pretty good against Jund from my experience as well. Getting the Phoenixes back repeatedly and repeatedly looping Demi-Lich and stuff has felt very strong in that matchup. Now, I think that might be partially because Surgical Extraction isn't that common in Jund at the moment, so if people do tweak their sideboards, that could even the matchup out there a little bit more. But in my opinion, if you want to beat Jund, you want to be running something like, you know, another mid-range deck that can go over the top in terms of value, like a Mardu Goyfs, a recursive deck that can play through the spot removal like Phoenix, or just generically powerful, less interactive decks that are full of 2-for-1s and are just focused on their proactive game plan, like Devotion, like Affinity, like Eldrazi, for example. So like I said, I'm not going to be revealing my Jund list yet because it's still in contention for me to play in the qualifier. But having said that, it's definitely not top of the list because I think, especially post Food Chain ban, another big weakness of Jund is that it will definitely have a big target on its back, meaning people are going to be naturally running decks that are good against it. People are going to be running sideboard cards like Rest in Peace as well. And so I think there's a decent chance I don't play it, in which case I will be making a video on it prior to the qualifier if Jund players are interested in seeing what my take on it right now. But I do want to quickly talk about some deck building changes that go against the grain a little bit that I've tried and had success with. And the main card I want to talk about here is Ignoble Hierarch. Now, there is a very good reason why most people are running this card, especially in a list with, you know, a pretty heavy mana curve skewed towards the 3 or 4 drop slot. Being able to accelerate into it is what gives this deck kind of an edge in terms of speed against those sorts of other variants like Mardu, for example. You know, especially accelerating into Pyrogoyf, and the Exalted is very big, especially in these Goyf mirror matches, to grow your Goyf to run over the opponents, if that makes sense. But I don't think it's necessary, right? If we have a look at the 3 drops we're accelerating into, going Hierarch on 1 into Pyrogoyf on turn 2 is going to be a 0-1 unless the opponent cracks a fetch land early on. Now, you can obviously go Hierarch into Pyrogoyf into some interaction to start filling the graveyard to attack, and then you obviously get the Exalted boost as well. But still, if your interaction doesn't line up very well against what the opponent's got, there's a decent chance that Pyrogoyf can sometimes get stonewalled, or, you know, the opponent can trade with it when it does attack. And then similarly, the other main 3 drop that we're looking to accelerate into is Jarsoul, and going Hierarch on 1 into Jarsoul on 2 doesn't really do anything either because you don't have a 1 drop in the graveyard. So I think another card you could consider in the 1-drop slot over Ignoble Hierarch that I've had decent success with is Swiftspear's Teaching. So this card did initially see play in Jund, you know, prior to the nerf, because obviously giving Pyrogoyf especially haste is a very big deal. There's a reason why people are running cards like Detective Phoenix and Arena of Glory, and I was kind of confused why this kind of fell off. Obviously losing prowess is a downside, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was in Izzet Wizards, where, you know, their whole deck is built around prowess. Using this on Dreadhorde Arcanist to buff its power to flashback stuff is very, very powerful. In this list, you don't really care that much about losing prowess, and this does offset some of the speed you would lose by replacing Hierarch as well, because, like I said, you can go Hierarch 1, Pyrogoyf 2, then interact, but you can also go Swiftspear's Teachings on 1, interact on 2, then Pyrogoyf on 3, and you're still attacking on turn 3. Not to mention it works very well with Jarsoul. You can go Teachings on 1, Jarsoul on 3, give it haste or prowess depending on the situation, flash it back, and then your next Goyf or Fear of Missing Out or whatever also gets haste, which is a really big deal. And the big advantage of running Teachings over Hierarch is that it gives you way more flexibility post sideboard, because I think in mid-range mirror matches, something I typically always like to do, especially in Historic, is trim discard spells post sideboard, because mid-range mirror matches often come down to top decks very easily, and if your deck is full of discard spells and your opponent's deck isn't full of discard spells and just has generically powerful proactive cards, you're going to be left in situations where the opponent's empty-handed, you draw a Thoughtseize off the top and it just does nothing, the opponent draws a Swiftspear's Teachings off the top, they draw a card, they can haste their next creature in, it just gives them an advantage as the game goes on, if that makes sense. And so running a card like Teachings over Ignoble Hierarch enables you to trim on discard spells post sideboard and still have enough 1-drops for Jarsoul, right? That's another thing I don't love about these Hierarch lists. They're a little short on 1-drops for Jarsoul. Like 12 is obviously decent, but I always like to go for 14, for example. So this just gives you flexibility to be able to cut discard spells in matchups where they're not as great. But again, there are definitely upsides of running Hierarch as well. It's just a different way that you could potentially build the deck. So very quickly, one downside that I forgot to mention of replacing Hierarch with Suspicious Teachings is that it does lower the creature count in the deck, which is a problem for Barrow-Goyf, right? You do need to retain a high creature count to ensure that Barrow-Goyf is consistently hitting, but you can get around that fairly easily just by rejigging the mana base and fitting in Boggart Trawler, right? You would have to cut some utility lands, but if you are cutting stuff like Arena of Glory, that's not really a downside if you've got Suspicious Teachings in the deck, which basically does the same thing, requiring less mountains. And I think in most matchups, finding a Boggart Trawler off a Barrow-Goyf is actually better than a Hierarch because the graveyard hate is very relevant. So that is obviously another downside, but you can get around that fairly easily. Now again, not saying it's always correct to cut the Hierarch, but it's just a different way you can build the deck if you want to be able to cut discard spells in the mirror match. So the next deck that I want to talk about here is Dimir Frog, which is basically the tempo control deck of the format. Now there's a ton of different ways you can build it. This list here from Nytoks, by the way, I'm going to have a link to both Nytoks and Käpälä's YouTube channel down in the description. Both lists that I've shown, the creators have YouTube channels. If you want to check out more historic competitive content, definitely go subscribe to those guys. Great content creators and great players as well. But you know, this particular build is not running Lurrus to give you access to cards like Barrow-Goyf, which is, you know, it really shores up the aggro matchups, ensures you have a source of life gain, and is just generically powerful with what the deck's trying to do. Kaito, Quantum Riddler works incredibly well with Psychic Frog because, you know, once you have this in play, you can start drawing 2 off the trigger. You can discard excess cards in order to ensure that you're drawing 2 off your draw step off it as well. And then you also get access to Harbinger of the Seas out of the sideboard, which punishes greedy mana bases and also decks that are built around specific lands like Lotus Field or Valakut that still see occasional play as well. But you can also obviously run Lurrus. Hydroponics Architect is another card I've seen quite commonly because you can fetch the buff the lands with Prismatic Vista and Lorien Revealed, and then obviously Lurrus gives you kind of a more guaranteed way to grind into the long game as well. But overall the deck is basically cheap interactions similar to Dimir, but you also get access to Psychic Frog, Tameo, which are 2 of the more powerful generic threats that really snowball the game, as well as counter spells, which is a pretty big deal because I said one of the weaknesses I've got with Jund is that if you're up against a deck with a ton of 2-for-1s, your discard spells are good at stopping them in the early game, but once they start drawing off the top, they can potentially draw off the top and then get back in the game if they draw a good card, whereas counter spells really help to mitigate against that. But having said that, I think the big weakness of Dimir, in my opinion, is that the colour combination just doesn't have good ways to deal with artifacts and enchantments. So if the opponent resolves a powerful artifact or enchantment, like a Birthing Ritual or a Retrofitter Foundry, for example, your only real way of dealing with those cards is bouncing it with a Sink into Stupor and then countering it again, which is a pretty big weakness because the colour combinations just don't have good ways to answer those sorts of cards. And also, I think it's less good at recovering, right? This deck does play similar to a tempo deck because of these cheap interaction and, you know, cheap threats as well. But if you have to tap out for a Psychic Frog and then the opponent resolves a threat that's really difficult for you to deal with, that can be difficult to recover from. Whereas obviously Jund has Jarsal to flash back your interaction and more ways to deal with creatures with Pyrogoyf in the deck as well. So I feel like this deck is a little bit more fragile at recovering from behind compared to Jund. But once you're ahead, your position is way more solidified because of the counter spells, if that makes sense. In terms of how the deck's changed since the food chain ban, again, very similar to Jund. I think the main advantages for this deck is that you just have, you know, you don't have to dedicate cards as much for the food chain matchup, which frees up main deck space, it frees up sideboard space. You don't really need to run stuff like Disruptor Flute or Annul or Spell Pierce or stuff like that, extra discard spells to stop the combo. So now you can focus a little bit more on the other matchups, if that makes sense. But again, I think another weakness of Dimir is now Jund, Dimir Affinity become the big top 3. So this deck is going to be accounted for in your opponent's deck choice and your opponent's sideboard choice as well, right? I think every deck is going to be prepared for Dimir in the same way that it's going to be prepared for Jund. So that is definitely a downside of the food chain ban as well. So I think another advantage of Dimir over Jund is Dimir doesn't really have one specific sideboard card that absolutely hoses the deck in the same way that Jund has Rest in Peace. Now, having said that, Rest in Peace is still reasonably effective against this particular build because it shuts off Barrow-Goyf and Snapcaster Mage and stops Psychic Frog from getting flying. But there are a decent number of Dimir builds that can just largely ignore Rest in Peace. So if you're struggling against Dimir and you're after sideboard cards to beat it, I think the first place I would look for is 1 and 2 mana artifacts and enchantments that generate value over time, like Retrofitter Foundry or Birthing Ritual. If you can find one of those that fits within your colour combination or especially fits well with your proactive game plan, that's a pretty effective way to go. Now, obviously, the opponent does run for Thoughtseize, for Counterspell, so there's a chance they can Thoughtseize it away or counter it if it's a 2-mana 1 and they're on the play. But getting these in play, especially it's not uncommon for the Dimir player to tap out on turn 2, so that gives you a window to resolve an artifact or enchantment that can really take over the game. That's a good way you can approach it. Outside of that, I also think, it is at the end of the day just a tempo deck, so running discard spells is pretty effective, especially because discard spells are naturally good against counter spells. So if you're in black, using these to get rid of their counter spell on turn 2 to clear the way is pretty effective. Even if you're in white, Thought Partition is a potential option there as well. Additionally, cheap counter spells that can stop their ones on the stack, like Spell Pierce, can also be pretty effective. And then outside of that, I think the main thing is just being able to stop Psychic Frog and Tameo. So if you're in white or black, cards like Fatal Push, if you're not running it in the main deck, cards like Seam Rip, just any way to kill these creatures before they start snowballing is a good way to slow the opponent down quite a lot anyway. But like I said, Dimir is much trickier to sideboard for compared to Jund because there isn't really a catch-all answer, if that makes sense. And now, similar to Jund, I'm not going to reveal my current build of Dimir yet because it's still in contention for me to play in the qualifier. But again, similar to Jund, it's definitely not top of the list because, again, I feel like it's a known entity. People are going to be targeting it with both deck choice and sideboard cards as well. And so I think there's a good chance I choose not to play it, in which case I will then make a video on it, hopefully before the qualifier. But I can't really talk too much about the different ways to build Dimir because I don't feel like there's a consensus core. There's so many different ways you can build a deck. You can run Lurrus, you can run Hydroponics Architect. There's a variety of different interaction that you could run as well. So I feel like there's too many options with Dimir that it's really worth talking about. But again, I think the main different one is Lurrus and Hydroponics Architect and Baleful Strix and stuff like that. Or no Lurrus to get Mardu Goyfs, Kaito, Quantum Riddler, and also Harbinger post sideboard. That's the main decision point with Dimir, in my opinion. So next up, we're going to be looking at Affinity, and this is my latest Affinity list, which I'm happy to share because I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be playing Affinity in the qualifier, which is kind of odd because I actually think that Affinity is probably the top deck that has become the best positioned post the food chain ban. But I'm going to be talking about why I think that is and why I'm not happy to play it in a minute. But if you're not familiar with the core of the deck, it's basically a very high synergy artifact deck that's looking to get a bunch of artifacts down very quickly to either get, a turn 1 or 2 Emery down or a very early Kappa Cannoneer, and then it either closes the game out with Kappa Cannoneer or using Arcbound Ravager to sacrifice tokens from weapon manufacturing. Now, in the past, before the release of Arcbound Ravager, my favourite builds of Affinity tended to be a little bit more interactive with main deck counter spells because one of the main synergies I really like setting up in this deck is Drix Interlacer plus Emery because the Interlacer doesn't lose intensity when it goes to the graveyard, meaning if this is drawing you 2 or 3 cards, if you replay it with Emery, it immediately draws you 2 or 3 cards again, and obviously as you draw more artifacts, you can put more intensity on and you just keep scaling more cards. And if you're running main deck counter spells, you can draw them off the Drix Interlacer, which then enables you to either protect your Emery to keep doing the loop or stop the opponent's proactive game plan, meaning that you can set up board states where you just keep drawing 5 or 6 cards every single turn, keep having constant counter spells to shut off what the opponent's doing. However, with the release of Arcbound Ravager, I'm much more interested in running the more explosive, proactive builds with 4 Pinnacle Emissary, 4 weapons manufacturing, which really increases the number of turn 2 or 3 Kappa Cannoneers that we have. But now with the release of Arcbound Ravager, we also have another way to win the game by sacrificing the weapons manufacturing tokens to either deal direct damage to the opponent or take out their creatures as well. Because prior to the release of Ravager, the only way we really had of using the manufacturing tokens was Ratchet Bomb, which isn't a very good card on its own, and is also pretty awkward to run in multiples. Whereas Arcbound Ravager, we're pretty happy to run this as a 3 or 4 because even without weapons manufacturing, you can sacrifice a bunch of your tokens to buff the Ravager, then sack the Ravager to put those tokens on a flyer from Pinnacle Emissary or Ornithopter to just attack in for lethal as well. So Ravager really gives us sort of an alternate win condition and pays us off a little bit more for going more all in on the proactive game plan. Not to mention, I do think that running more proactive builds also helps to improve the matchup against Dimir and Jund, which are obviously going to be much more popular now Food Chain's been banned. Speaking of which, like I said, I think with the Food Chain ban, this is the top deck that benefits the most because, first of all, I feel like Food Chain was a pretty poor matchup for Affinity in general. You do obviously often have main deck counter spells like Force of Negation or Metallic Rebuke, but outside of that, you didn't really have any good ways of stopping the opponent comboing off, and with a deck like that can combo off on turn 2 or 3 pretty consistently, that's pretty difficult for Affinity to consistently beat, if that makes sense. So losing that matchup is a bonus for Affinity. Then secondly, like I said, I think the other 4 decks, Jund, Dimir, Affinity, and Auras, the prominence of Jund and Dimir because we lost Food Chain kind of pushes Auras out a little bit. I think Auras is naturally very weak against both Jund and Dimir, which is a really good thing for Affinity, because out of those 4 decks, Auras is by far your worst matchup. I feel like Affinity is naturally pretty good against Jund and Dimir, especially if you're running a more proactive build like this, because it's very difficult for Jund and Dimir to have counter spells for all of your top threats, especially against Jund. You have a lot of cards that you can top deck and immediately get you back into the game, like Käpälä, Arcbound Ravager, Drix Interlacer, stuff like that as well. And so I naturally feel like Affinity, you know, has a decent matchup against Jund and Dimir. The only other prominent deck prior to Food Chain in Auras that was a difficult matchup is kind of getting pushed out, because now it has Jund and Dimir to contend with, and you know, Auras was naturally good against Food Chain, which is now not in the format anymore. So I do think overall, out of the pre-existing top decks, Affinity does gain the most from the Food Chain ban. But I'm not happy to run I'm not happy to run Affinity, because the big issue with it in general, and this has kind of been the case ever since it's a deck in Historic, is it's really risky to run when it's a known top deck, because there's some narrow sideboard options that are incredibly good against you. So I've brought up the main ones here. As you can see, if you're in white, red or green, you have some really brutal sideboard cards against Affinity. So white, I think the best ones are Divine Purge and Wrath of the Skies. In red, Byforce and Meltdown are probably the best ones, but I also wanted to highlight Brotherhood's End and Shatterstorm as well, because they have seen some play in the past. And then in green, you have access to the newly unbanned Force of Vigor as well as Fade from History. And I'm pretty sure if a deck is running any of these colours, with Affinity being known as one of the best proactive decks, people will be running these cards in the sideboard, even though they're very narrow. Now, obviously, you do have access to counter spells in order to stop these. In my list, I'm running Force of Negation and Machinist Dismissal, but again, if you don't have access to these, which you won't always, and the opponent happens to draw these, which I'm pretty sure they will see play in pretty high numbers, it's just going to be absolutely brutal to beat. Now, having said that, I think Weapons Manufacturing does provide you with some insurance against these, which is another reason why I quite like running it in this sort of build, because if the opponent's running a destruction-based one, which is basically all of them, Divine Purge is basically the only one that doesn't destroy. If you've already got a very fast start with Weapons Manufacturing, you can deal the opponent a ton of damage or take out all their creatures, for example. And also, even if the opponent does have Divine Purge, Weapons Manufacturing is an enchantment, so it will survive. And then, obviously, since Divine Purge allows you to recast stuff from exile, you can kind of rebuild your board with Weapons Manufacturing. So another big reason why I like this build is it does provide you with more resilience to these sorts of cards. But having said that, if the opponent does get one of these down early, it is especially brutal. So that's the main reason why I'm not running, or I'm not keen to run Affinity, because I do feel while it's a known top deck, these will be seen play in people's sideboards, and they will be very, very difficult to beat consistently. And additionally, I also feel like, you know, it's difficult to win the mirror match, right? I do feel like these sorts of builds will be quite popular, and I feel like there's not really a great way to get an edge in the mirror, really. It's just whoever has the fastest start wins, which isn't ideal if this is a deck I expect to see a lot of play. So those are the main reasons why I'm personally not happy to be running Affinity in the qualifier. So the last deck, or the last kind of pre-Food Chain main deck that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail here, is Boros Auras, because obviously I've made a video on this deck quite recently, and I just think that this deck is in a really, really tough position right now. So prior to the Food Chain ban, like I said a few times, I feel like the top 5 established decks were Food Chain, Dimir, Jund, Auras, and Affinity. And I feel like Affinity, into that metagame, you are running it to beat Food Chain and Affinity, and you had really tricky matchups against both Dimir and Jund. Even with some of the new innovations that I was running, like a Dante Vanguard and Rest in Peace, for example. Now with Food Chain gone, the only real top deck that you're actively good against is Affinity, right? You really, really struggle against Dimir and Jund, which is really awkward. So I have changed what my list would look like. If you are going to run Auras, this is probably the list I would play. I'm still on Boros over Mardu, because I feel like Mardu just straight up loses to Harbinger of the Seas or Magus of the Moon. And the main changes I've made since the last video is I've replaced Thought Partition back with Mother of Runes again. The main reason I was running Thought Partition was because of the increase of Food Chain. Having access to Thought Partition against combo decks like Food Chain was really, really important, whereas now I feel like Dimir and Jund become the more popular decks, and Mother of Runes is definitely better in those sorts of matchups. And then I've also moved Dante Vanguard to the main deck, right? I had Doorkeeper Thrall in the main deck previously, but the main reason I was trying to run ETB Hate was because of Food Chain. Now with Food Chain gone, obviously Doorkeeper Thrall is still good against Affinity and some of the more fringe decks, but I feel like a Dante Vanguard is the much better card in the main deck when the format is a little bit more interactive. And then in the sideboard, I've decided to still have the 4 copies of Thought Partition, because I feel like an issue for Auras, even outside of combo decks, which you still might face in the qualifier, is board sweepers. I think especially post-sideboard, a lot of decks will be bringing in board sweepers against you, which are really difficult to stop. Even if you have a Dante Vanguard, there's Divine Purge and Toxic Deluge, which can get around it. So Thought Partition, very important if you come across any combo or sweepers. And then Doorkeeper Thrall, I still have it here as a 2 of, but I've got it here as a 2 of. I've gone 4 Partition, 2 Doorkeeper Thrall, because obviously, against Affinity, it's still very good, but Affinity is already a good matchup even without Doorkeeper Thrall. And outside of that, there aren't that many decks utilizing ETBs that are likely to be popular outside of, especially with Food Chain being gone now as well. But outside of that, the list is pretty much the same. But like I said, I feel like the metagame shifting to Dimir, Jund, and Affinity, you only really have a good matchup against Affinity. Now, having said that, you will likely be good against a lot of the more fringe decks. I think if you expect people to be running decks to beat Jund and Dimir, then Auras might be worth looking at, but it's a risk, because if people do choose to run the interactive decks, especially because there are more interactive decks like Azorius and Jeskai that are still seeing some play that are very difficult matchups for you, because they can main deck stuff like Divine Purge, which is super difficult to stop without Thought Partition. I just feel like Auras is in a really tough position right now, and I would only recommend running it if you think people are going to go a level above Jund and Dimir to try and target those decks, if that makes sense. Then next up, I'm going to be having a look at some of the other decks in the format. I'm not going to be going as in-depth on these, so I'm not going to have a full deck list for all of them, partially because I might still be working on it for the qualifier and I want to keep my version of the deck under wraps, but also because I just don't have time to go as in-depth on all of these, otherwise the video will take ages. So I'll show you the key cards and explain how the deck works so that it's on your radar, so that you know that it exists, and so if you think of picking it up, what the core of the deck is so you can see. And then I'm going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses, why it might, where it's well positioned, where it might not be, and some other potential deck list innovations that I've been working on that I haven't seen other people on, in case you want to pick the deck up or you're considering playing it and you want to see some tweaks that you could potentially make. So we're starting off here with Izzet Phoenix, which is a very spell-based deck, mainly built around Arclight Phoenix. We want to get this into the graveyard, cast multiple spells in a turn, and get it back from the graveyard repeatedly. Demi-Lich is the other main threat that's commonly run in this deck, but you also have stuff like Tamiyo, which is pretty commonly run. Now, the main reason that this deck has seen a resurgence, it's been a deck in Historic for a very long time, is mainly the addition of Manamorphose, because this now enables us to bring back Phoenix on turn 2, right? On turn 2, you can go Manamorphose, a 1-mana spell, and Faithless Looting, ditch 2 Arclight Phoenixes and get them back immediately, which is really strong. And also Manamorphose enables us to cast Demi-Lich ahead of turn 4, which is a pretty big deal. Now, I think the big appeal to Phoenix right now is that, like I said, Jund and Dimir definitely the two best, or the two most prominent interactive decks, which are almost all reliant on just using single target removal. So if you have a threat like Arclight Phoenix, which obviously can get hit by cards like Fatal Push, but if you can just keep bringing them back from the graveyard over and over again, you can kind of overwhelm their spot removal, get in for a lot of damage very early on, and then close the game out very quickly, which is difficult for them to stop with their single target removal. And then it is a very powerful proactive game plan. In other matchups, you can oftentimes go over the top of a deck like Affinity if they don't have an early Pinnacle Emissary, for example. So, you've got your early cantrips, some burn spells, Faithless Looting is the key card to get it in the graveyard, and then you do fill your graveyard so quickly, especially when you've got Prismatic Vista in the mana base, that you can easily run 4 Treasure Cruise to just refuel very easily. So in terms of positioning, I do think it's a very well... it's a good deck naturally into Dimir and Jund, but the big issue for this deck is graveyard hate, and that's always been the case. But I think especially right now, with Jund being one of the top decks, I think Rest in Peace is going to see a lot of sideboard play, which this deck takes splash damage from that, right? You're incidentally going to get hit by all the people that are running Rest in Peace for Jund, because Rest in Peace is very, very good against you. You don't really want to have to splash into a third color, and the only real ways you have of getting rid of Rest in Peace is using a card like Into the Floodmoor, or just bouncing it temporarily to buy a turn of graveyard, which really isn't that great. I think outside of Rest in Peace, the next most commonly played graveyard hate is likely to be Surgical Extraction, which is especially brutal against Phoenix, right? Because you need to put your Phoenix in the graveyard to do your proactive game plan, and if the opponent, they not only shut off the turn by getting rid of the Arclight Phoenix, but they can also extract all the other ones from your deck, leaving you reliant on Demi-Lich and Tamiyo to close the game out, which is pretty awkward. And then I think Endurance is another, recently unbanned card that I think the green decks could be interested in running if they're running cards like Birthing Ritual or Nature's Rhythm or Chord of Calling. And this is also very good because it doesn't cost them any mana like Surgical, so they can stop the Arclight Phoenix even if they're tapped out. And if they do have the mana to flash this in, they can, block Arclight Phoenixes that you already have in play, or stop Tamiyos from attacking, for example, whilst exiling your entire graveyard, which is not only good at stopping Arclight Phoenix, but also shutting off cards like Treasure Cruise and Demi-Lich as well. So I think the commonly played graveyard hate is the really big sticking point for this. And like I said, I do expect these to be very popular because, you know, the Goyfs are very popular in both Jund and in Dimir to a certain extent. Mardu Goyfs is another deck that I expect to see some amount of play, so I do think a lot of people are going to be targeting the graveyard, which incidentally hits your deck as well, which is pretty awkward. In terms of deck building innovations, one thing that I do find a little bit awkward with the list that I've tried and seen is that the deck does feel a little bit light on ways to discard Aquatic Phoenix. Obviously, Faithless Looting is just by far and away the best one, but most lists I've seen are relying on using their cantrip effects to find Faithless Looting to pitch Phoenix, which might be alright for the most part, but I would like, ideally, a little bit more discard. The awkward thing, though, is that we don't really have great options, right? Ledger Shredder is a card that has seen play in the past, but without having access to something like Mishra's Bauble, it's basically impossible for us to trigger this the turn it comes down unless you're main decking Surgical Extraction, which doesn't seem very good to me. And so this is going to die before you get access to the discard off it fairly consistently, so I don't love that as an extra use. And then I have been running a few builds running Artist Talent instead of Tamiyo, with the idea being you basically blank all of your opponent's single target removal game one, right? Their Fatal Pushes does nothing because your two threats are Arclight Phoenix and Demi-Lich, which you can just keep recasting. And Artist Talent enables you to not only discard Phoenixes that you draw very easily, but it fills the graveyard so quickly for cards like Treasure Cruise. So the idea with these sorts of builds is you have Artist Talent, Arclight Phoenix and Demi-Lich game one, which then incentivizes your opponent to cut their single target removal, and then post sideboard you can bring in other threats like Tamiyo or Thing in the Ice, for example. But the awkward thing is, you know, the opponent isn't always going to take out their spot removal, which isn't great. Artist Talent is very susceptible to cards like Narset and other ways that stop you looting, and also it leaves you pretty threat light, right? If your main deck is just Arclight Phoenix, Demi-Lich, all the opponent needs is a couple of Surgical Extractions and you're kind of out of threats entirely, which is a bit awkward. So I'm not sure there's a great solution to that. Maybe it is just fine to run a bunch of cantrips and then you'll find your Faithless Lootings eventually. And then one other card that I haven't really seen anyone else run that I think is a pretty interesting one to consider here is Strike It Rich, because to me, the whole reason this deck has kind of had a resurgence is the addition of Manamorphose, which, like I said, enables the turn 2 Phoenix and enables us to cast Demi-Lich ahead of curve. But the thing is, if you don't have a Manamorphose, you're kind of back to the old slower builds of Phoenix, where you don't get your Phoenixes back till turn 3, you don't get Demi-Lich down till turn 4. And so Strike It Rich is just another way that we can enable the turn 2 Phoenixes and the, accelerating into Demi-Liches a little bit earlier, right? You can get Demi-Lich down on turn 2 if you have both Strike It Rich and Manamorphose together. And additionally, it provides you with another card that you can discard for value to something like Faithless Looting as well. So again, definitely another way you could consider building the deck. Not saying it's better than the builds that are out there at the moment, but if you wanted to focus a little bit more on accelerating into these, Strike It Rich is another way that you can consider it. But again, the big reason why I'm not super keen on it is just I expect Graveyard Hate to be popular because of the Goyfs, and that incidentally hits this deck as well. And then on a similar note, we've got Izzet Wizards, which is kind of a similar deck to Izzet Phoenix, but it basically trades resilience for speed. This is much more of a pure aggro deck, and as its name suggests, you're largely built around Wizards. Symmetry Sage, Dreadhorde Arcanist, and Slickshot Show Off are usually the staples, and then you have a couple of other options as well. You have access to 8 Lightning Bolt style effects in Chain Lightning and Wizards Lightning. Flame of Anora is another payoff for running a bunch of Wizards. Getting both modes off this is very nice as well. But the big issue that I've got with Wizards as a deck is it feels very similar to Auras. It has a very similar matchup spread where you're very good against the less interactive decks because your deck is so reliant on your creatures surviving, and that's very risky to run in a format where Dimir and Jund are two of the most popular decks, right? Like I said, Wizards really needs its creatures to survive to really apply pressure, and in a format where the two most common decks are running Fatal Push and Abrupt Decay and Thoughtseize in pretty high numbers, it's very difficult to consistently beat that. Now, I do think that Wizards has a better game against Jund and Dimir than Auras does, because you have ways to grind into the long game. You have Ponder, you have access to Expressive Iteration, you can run the Chorus package with Ribble Chanty and Hymn to the Ages that can draw you into more creatures to keep applying pressure, whereas Auras, for example, if you lose your first creature, you're then reliant on Lurrus, and then if they take away the Lurrus, you're basically just drawing off the top of your deck until you find a creature, which is just pure variance at that point. So I do think Wizards has a slightly better time against the interactive decks than Auras does, and additionally, I do think the reason to be running Wizards is to punish the decks that people might be running to go over the top of Dimir and Jund. Not only do I think Wizards has a good matchup against Affinity, but those decks that I mentioned earlier that are very proactive and less interaction, like Devotion, like Affinity, like Eldrazi, right? Devotion only really has Karna's interaction, which is very slow. Eldrazi only really has Kozilek's Command in the main deck, maybe Ugin's Binding as well, but that's quite slow. And then Affinity, they do have some counter spells, but in terms of spot removal, they only really have Aether Spellbomb, which isn't good against you because a lot of your creatures have haste, and Galvanic Blast, which they don't commonly run that highly in high numbers in the main deck as well. So I think if you're running Izzet Wizards, it's kind of a similar reason to Boros Auras. You're good against Affinity, and you're also good against the less interactive decks that people might be running to go over the top of Dimir and Jund. But if you're expecting the interactive decks to be represented, not only Dimir and Jund, but also Azorius and Jeskai Control as well, then Wizards is pretty risky, right? This deck kind of started to see way less play after the Swiftspear's Teachings nerf. I've seen a lot of people go back to Reckless Charge in order to kind of get around that, and Reckless Charge instead of Swiftspear's Teachings makes the deck so much more so much weaker to spot removal, because if you have a creature and then you use a Reckless Charge on it and the opponent kills it in response, that's an absolute blowout. So unless you can stomach running nerfed Swiftspear's Teachings, which has a real cost in this sort of deck because it doesn't give a card like Dreadhorde Arcanist prowess, which enables you to flash back more expensive cards way more easily, then I'm not sure I would suggest this. The only reason I would suggest running Wizards is if you expect Dimir and Jund to be not as popular, you expect people to go like a level above with the less interactive decks, at which point this deck is good, but it is risky if you expect the interactive decks. So then next up we got Mardu Goyfs, which is basically a variation of Jund, losing access to green to give you white, which gives you access to the Overlord package with Dollmaker and Felia, as well as other main deck cards like Peddler and some other white sideboard cards, which are pretty nice to have access to as well. Now before I get into the details of this one, I do want to quickly address that even though when I'm previewing these decks, I've got all these cards listed as 4-ofs. The only reason I've done this is so that it spaces the cards out a little bit more. You shouldn't just think every card in here should be run as a 4-off. I'm only doing that just to spread them out a little bit more. So in this list, for example, you definitely wouldn't run both 4 Dollmaker and 4 Felia, for example. But the advantages of this list is you grind a lot more. I think Overlord in particular is such an effective card in grindy matchups, especially against Jund. Even Dimir often struggles to deal with this because, if you get this down on turn 2 without a counterspell, and then you can flash in a Felia or, resolve a Dollmaker through a counterspell, then you can blink it. Getting access to Thoughtseize and Juggernaut Peddler gives you access to more interaction without having a lot of dead top decks once the opponent's empty-handed as well. So I think, especially in the grindy matchups, this sort of deck definitely has its advantages. And also there are some white sideboard cards that can help to improve other matchups quite a lot as well. But my big issue with this sort of deck is that the curve is pretty clunky, right? One of the big things that you lose by giving up green is the acceleration in Ignoble Hierarch and Malevolent Rumble as well. I think especially having to wait until turn 4 to cast Pyrogoyf is a bit of an issue in some games. And the other thing is, I think for Overlord to be good, you really do want to be running Dollmaker, but Mardu doesn't really have any 1-mana permanents that are good to blink with Dollmaker, meaning that Dollmaker is essentially a 3-drop, right? If you don't happen to have Overlord, then the only other cards that are really good to blink are stuff like Juggernaut Peddler. Some builds run Momentum Breaker as well, which is also decent to blink, but again, it basically makes Dollmaker a 3-drop. So if you have a look at this curve, it's way more, clunky towards the 3-drop slot. I also feel like Overlord is such an important card in the deck. It's basically difficult for Overlord to be good without running Felia and Dollmaker, but it's difficult in Mardu colors to make Felia and Dollmaker good on their own, if that makes sense. That's the big issue I have with the deck. It feels a little bit too over-reliant on Overlord, and the curve is a little bit clunky without the acceleration. But if you are running sort of the grindy matchups, if you are expecting a lot of Jund and Dimir, then this isn't a bad choice. But against the rest of the field, you are a little bit slower, if that makes sense. In terms of other options that I've considered to make to make dedicated Dollmaker and Felia a little better when you don't have Overlord, I think Oath of Nissa is the main one, right? The main reason why we've seen mostly Abzan builds of Overlord is because Oath of Nissa does make dedicated Dollmaker and Felia much better, because you can go, Oath of Nissa, find a Felia or a Dollmaker or an Overlord or a land, blink it, find another thing like a Goyf, for example, and then Dollmaker becomes a 2-drop again. The curve becomes a lot lower and less clunky. But the issue here is obviously you really want to have red for access to Pyrogoyf. That's one of the main top ends of the deck and the main reasons to be running the deck. Now, I did actually try a few builds that were Abzan splashing red for Pyrogoyf, running 4 starting town, 4 mana confluence, and then a single mountain that you could fetch off your Prismatic Vista, and then you also get access to Malevolent Rumble, which kind of overcomes the issue of not having any acceleration. But first of all, it's tricky to find room for everything to fit interaction as well. But most of all, the mana was just absolutely abysmal, especially with Harbinger still seeing some play and having to run 4 Confluence, 4 Starting Town, 4 Vista, and a bunch of Shocklands as well. The mana base just felt really, really tricky in those sorts of decks. So I think the main issue I have with this sort of deck is that we don't have an Oath of Nissa in Mardu colours, right? If this card was in Mardu, I think the deck would be significantly better. You could run Dollmaker and Felia in higher numbers without having to worry as much and not being as so reliant on Overlord. But again, I still think the deck definitely has its position, especially if you expect the metagame to be more grindy. And I also think there are some white sideboard cards that are very nice to have access to, like Fragment Reality and especially Divine Purge as well. Not Rest in Peace, obviously, because Rest in Peace is very good against the deck. The reason I want to highlight this is because I do think one of the other downsides of running Mardu is you get hit especially hard by Rest in Peace, similar to Jund, but it also shuts off Overlord from really doing anything once it's in play as well. So similar to Phoenix, I feel like this is another deck that will really get hit by people running Rest in Peace for Jund as well. So overall, my opinion on this deck is if you expect a lot of Jund and if you expect a lot of grindy matchups in general, then it's a good way to go over the top of those sorts of decks. But the deck does feel a little bit inconsistent. It feels a little bit too over-reliant on Overlord. And unless we can find a 1-mana card to blink with Dollmaker and Felia, these sorts of cards aren't that great when you don't open with Overlord, if that makes sense. The next up we got Devotion, which is a very powerful proactive ramp deck, which can produce a ton of mana incredibly quickly using cards like Fanatic of Ronus with, we have a lot of 4-power creatures that will turn this on. Then you can tap it to play Kiora, untap it to play something else. Nykthos produces a huge amount of mana, which we can use to untap with Kiora. Storm the Festival can enable some very explosive combo-esque turns. Utopia Sprawl is incredibly good with Kiora as well. So the deck is very, very good proactively. And I think in the current metagame, this is one of those decks that I do think benefit a lot from the Food Chain ban, because I feel like with Food Chain around, Devotion has a really tricky time defeating those sorts of decks consistently, because your only real interaction comes from Khan, which takes a while to get online. And so with Food Chain being able to kill pretty consistently on turn 2 or 3, you don't really have good ways to stop that. Some builds were splashing white for Elesh Non, but you typically don't run this in very high numbers, and you would have to resolve a 5-mana card before the opponent combos off for that to work as well. So losing Food Chain from the format is a big bonus for Devotion, because one of your worst matchups is gone. And then the result of Food Chain going, like I said, is Dimir and Jund rising to the top, Auras kind of falling off, and Affinity being up there as well. And I feel like all of those things are good for Devotion. I feel like Devotion is naturally pretty good against Affinity. Maybe now with Ravager weapons manufacturing, that might change a little bit, because in the past, the only real way that Affinity could beat Devotion was with a very fast Kappa Cannoneer. Now with manufacturing plus Arcbound Ravager, that might change a little bit. But again, Devotion's running Khan, which shuts off tons of the artifact abilities as well as Ravager as well. So I still feel like that matchup should be pretty favoured for Devotion. And then against Dimir and Jund, it can be a tricky matchup depending on how the opponent's interaction lines up against you, but typically against those matchups you can sneak stuff underneath their counter spells, you can run them out of discard spells, and you have a ton of really good top decks that can just instantly get you back in the game as well. You have a ton of really good ways to swarm the board. You have a lot of cards that can be recast from the graveyard, like Fanatic of Ronus and Storm the Festival as well. So I do feel like on average Devotion should be pretty good against Dimir and Jund as well. So as long as the current metagame stays at what it is going into the qualifier, I feel like this should be a pretty good choice, because the big weakness of Devotion is the same that it has been for years at this point, in that you really tend to struggle against the fast aggro and fast combo decks. But it feels like with Dimir and Jund at the top of the format, they really push out the fast aggro decks like Auras and like Wizards, because they obviously have a ton of cheap interaction, which is their biggest weak point. So if that stays the same, the aggro decks won't be as popular. And sort of similar thing with the combo decks as well. Jund and Dimir running a ton of discard spells and counter spells makes running combo pretty tricky, which is another really bad matchup for Devotion. So I think the risk with Devotion is, first of all, there's less player agency with this sort of deck, right? You're just doing your proactive thing, kind of similar to Auras, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And the other thing is, I'm sure there will be some people out there thinking, I expect people to run decks like Devotion to go over the top of Jund and Dimir, in which case I might run Wizards or Auras to be able to win against those sorts of decks as well. So I think it largely just depends on how many people try and one-up the current metagame, if that makes sense. So next up on a very similar note, we have Eldrazi, which is another powerful proactive ramp deck, which is full of a lot of 2-for-1s that give you a good chance of grinding against those sorts of interactive decks. Now, I do want to quickly talk about the different builds of Eldrazi, because prior to the BNR, there were a ton of different decks. that were viable, but with the Eldrazi Temple ban, I think that was the nail in the coffin for the aggressive builds. You know, I think the aggressive builds were really built on being able to cast their 3-drops on turn 2, and with both Eldrazi Temple and crop rotation going, you really can't do that consistently anymore. And I also think one of the big reasons to run Eldrazi at the moment is because a lot of their cards are inherent 2-for-1s, even through counter spells, right? You've got cards like Sowing Microspawn, Devourer of Destiny, Null Drifter, and then there's obviously some other options as well, like the 7-mana Ugin Planeswalker, you've got World Breaker as well, and so it feels to me like, especially in a metagame full of discard spells and counter spells, you really want to prioritize running Eldrazi that 2-for-1 to ensure that you can outgrind the opponent's interaction, and cards like Eldrazi Linebreaker and Fleshraker just trade 1-for-1 with interaction, whether that's counter spells or just spot removal as well. So it feels like not only are the aggro builds impossible now because they just don't have consistent 3-mana on turn 2, but they're also not great into a field full of counter spells and discard spells as well. So I think the old Simic builds are the way to go, and you do have a lot of good ramp. Ugin's Labyrinth is obviously a really great way to still cheat on mana, enables you to cast your talismans on turn 2. And the big difference between Eldrazi and Devotion, I think Devotion is much more explosive and has a much higher ceiling in terms of the proactive game plan of the deck. But the advantage of running Eldrazi is it does have much better interaction, meaning that your matchups against decks like Auras and Wizards, while still probably not favoured, are much better because you do have cards like Kozilek's Command, which is still one of the most generically powerful cards in the format, and this is probably the best deck at utilising it. And also Ugin's Binding is very good against a number of matchups as well, especially if you go Rumble, mill over the Binding, find a Null Drifter. Bouncing your opponent's whole board on turn 3 is so brutal in a number of matchups, especially against a deck like Affinity as well. So yeah, overall I think this deck has a similar matchup spread to Devotion, where you're a powerful, proactive deck that is capable of outgrinding the counter spells and discard spells because of the inherent 2-for-1s of cards like Kozilek's Command, Microspawn, Devourer, and Null Drifter. Obviously, losing Eldrazi Temple is a really big hit to the speed and consistency of the deck, which I think is the biggest thing holding it back. But we do have access to Echoing Cavern now, which I do think is a pretty good replacement for the current metagame, because, like I said, you're still a ramp deck, you're still trying to generate a lot of mana early in the game, and even if the opponent does get rid of your top end with discard spells, for example, you can just pump your early acceleration into your Echoing Cavern at the end of the opponent's turn, tutor up an Eldrazi, and then just cast that during your turn. And again, even if the opponent has counter spells, if you find one of your 2-for-1 Eldrazi with cast triggers, even if you don't have a Cavern of Souls, you still get to 2-for-1 the opponent as well. So I think this is another option for a deck that is relatively well positioned if you expect Jund's Dimir Affinity to be the top deck. Again, I don't think you're quite as explosive as a deck like Devotion, but again, you have a little bit more interaction, which hedges your matchups against those more aggressive decks as well. But again, same sort of thing pre-BNR. The two biggest weaknesses of Eldrazi, very similar to Devotion, are the fast aggro and the fast combo decks. Again, fast aggro not as much of a concern because you've got Kozilek's Command, Ugin's Binding, and you can sideboard Dismember as well. But then fast combo decks, are very, very difficult for you to beat. You don't really have good ways to deal with them. Torpor Orb is a nice option post-sideboard, especially because that does shut off stuff like Pyrogoyf as well. But you don't really have good ways to shut off other combo decks. But again, I think it's a reasonable hedge to say right now, with Dimir and Jund being so popular, there's a chance that combo might not be that represented anyway. So that's kind of similar sort of metagame space as Devotion, if that makes sense. Then next up we got Jeskai Lotus Field Control, which is a control deck largely built around using Strict Proctor and Stifle or Consign to Memory in order to scam, Flage, Null Drifter, or Lotus Field into play. So the idea here is, for example, you cast Strict Proctor, and then if you play Lotus Field, it will trigger the Strict Proctor, allowing you to kind of cancel the sacrifice trigger on Lotus Field, immediately ramping you, or you can go Strict Proctor into Flage on turn 3 or Null Drifter on turn 3 and get to keep the creature around. Now, typically, in addition to Strict Proctor, you would run Consign to Memory in this slot in order to do the same sort of thing, stop the Lotus Field trigger, stop the Null Drifter or the Flage from sacrificing themselves. But I feel like right now, with Eldrazi largely being a fringe deck, I feel like Stifle has higher upside because basically every deck is running Prismatic Vista ever since Magus and Harbinger were unbanned. So being able to use Stifle to counter the opponent's Prismatic Vista on 1 feels like it has way higher upside than Consign. But, you know, it's a relatively minor change. You could still run Consign if you wanted to, but in general, the idea here is we can scam these into play, to get ahead on the board really quickly. And then the rest of the deck is just interaction, whether that's counter spells or largely going to be creature removal, because a lot of your proactive stuff is sorcery speed, meaning it's kind of awkward to want to Proctor, Flage, or Null Drifter and still hold open counter spells, but you could still run counter spells if you wanted to. Just a little bit awkward between the two. And then obviously card advantage, especially if you're running Lotus Field, you want to have ways to recoup the early investment to get the mana. Running cards like Stock Up or Memory Deluge or Consult the Star Charts. Actually, Consult the Star Charts probably not very good with Lotus Field because you are sometimes going to have to sacrifice lands, but you get the picture. This is the core of the deck, and then the rest of the list is largely filled out with interaction and card advantage. Another possible way that you could build a deck if you don't want to run Lotus Field and have to run cards that can be awkward on their own like Stifle is to run Doorkeeper Thrall or Torpor Orb instead of Strict Proctor. I much prefer Doorkeeper Thrall because it makes it much easier to run counter spells alongside it, because it means you don't have to tap out on turn 2, right? You can pass the turn with counter spells and Thrall open and then counter something if you need to, or if not, you can flash the Thrall in. And then that also enables you to run Arena of Glory, which is really huge with Flage and Null Drifter, right? Because if you go Doorkeeper Thrall end of turn 2, you can then activate Arena of Glory to haste in Flage. It doesn't die because of the Doorkeeper Thrall trigger, and then attack in immediately and get a Flage trigger, or a same sort of thing with Null Drifter. I don't think you can run Strict Proctor and Lotus Field with Arena of Glory because, like I said, Lotus Field is sometimes going to act normally. You're not always going to have Strict Proctor or Stifle alongside it, and it's really tricky to run Arena of Glory and enough mountains to have it enter untapped and Lotus Field as well. I feel like you kind of have to pick a lane a little bit here, but this sort of deck in general, I was much higher on it prior to the food chain ban, because one of the big advantages of this is shutting off ETBs when it's relevant is huge. And when food chain was one of the best decks, not only did it shut off the food chain combo, but it also shut off largely their backup game plan, whether that was the humans plan or goblins was also running food chain as well. Whereas now, I don't feel like ETB hate is as well positioned, and I feel like this sort of deck in general is pretty weak into Dimir and Jund because of the discard spells and the counter spells, especially this sort of build where, you know, if the opponent takes away a Strict Proctor or whatever, you can be left with Lotus Field having to tap you out. If you're reliant on a hand using Lotus Field and Stifle, they can get rid of this, or God forbid you Lotus Field on turn 2 with Stifle and they counter the Stifle and you sacrifice all of your lands. That's really brutal as well. So I feel like prior to food chain ban, this was actually a reasonably well positioned deck, but into a field that is largely going to be decks like Dimir and Jund that have a lot of efficient ways to break up your game plan. Their discard spells are going to trade very favorably with your other interaction, for example. I just feel like those decks are going to go underneath you fairly easily. So again, it's an option, but I don't particularly love it into a field of Dimir and Jund personally. The next up we got High Noon, which is basically a counterspell tempo deck where you're running 4 Reprieve, 4 Remand to counter whatever the opponent's trying to cast, and then you've obviously got Aven Interrupter, Ang, Spell Queller, Sink into Stupor to just keep countering whatever the opponent's trying to do. Now, obviously, the downside of a game plan like this is if the opponent is running, you know, multiple cheap spells, then they could, you know, you counter the first one and they can just get some other stuff into play. And that's where the namesake card of the deck, High Noon, gets in, you know, really helps to mitigate that, because if you get High Noon down, the opponent is stuck to 1 spell a turn, and if they're stuck to 1 spell a turn, you can just keep countering whatever they do. You know, ensure that you don't run out of gas with Reprieve and Remand, and then with Aven Interrupter, Ang, and Spell Queller, you can start getting on the board, start attacking the opponent, and basically act like a tempo deck. Now, prior to the food chain ban, I actually think this was a pretty well-positioned deck because High Noon was a very good card against the food chain deck, right? It basically stopped them comboing off, and then High Noon itself is pretty effective in a number of other matchups, right? It's very good against Auras because it limits them to 1 aura per turn. It's very good against Phoenix, limits them to 1 spell per turn. Same sort of thing with Izzet Wizards. Can be effective in some other matchups as well, like against Jund, for example. But the big issue now is that with food chain gone, like I keep saying, I feel like the decks that have risen to the top that are going to be popular, Jund, Dimir, Affinity, I feel like you're reasonable against Jund and Affinity, but against Dimir, it's just lights out. I have tried so many different things to improve the Dimir matchup, but the awkward thing is if they resolve a Psychic Frog, you're just screwed because they're going to keep drawing cards. If you spend your turn bouncing the Psychic Frog, they could counterspell it. High Noon in general isn't very good against decks that can play instant speed because they can play a card during their and your turn as well. But the biggest thing is if they get Psychic Frog into play, then you don't have many cards that can answer it. You've got Ang and Sink into Stupor, which they can both counter, and if you do then use that to bounce their Psychic Frog, you've used your spell for the turn. They can then just recast it or cast something else. So for me, this matchup has felt really good against most of the field, but the Dimir matchup I just haven't been able to figure out. Now, having said that, there are some innovations that I've tried in the list that I do think improve the deck in a generic sense, that have really helped improve the matchups across the board, and that is running Enlightened Tutor. So in general, I'm not a massive fan of this card because putting a card on top of your library is so much worse than putting it into your hand, but the deck operates so much better with High Noon. And obviously with Enlightened Tutor, you can go Tutor on turn 1 into High Noon on turn 2 to get it down as early as possible. And if you look at the deck, obviously I don't have the full deck list here, but the deck in general doesn't run very many 1-drops at all. Typically it's Tamiyo, maybe Fragment Reality as well. So with a serious lack of 1-drops, I really like running Enlightened Tutor to ensure that you had the High Noon on turn 2. And then it also gives you other options to search depending on the matchup, right? I think running out turn 2 High Noon against a deck like Jund is good if you're on the play, but if not, it then opens up a turn where your shield's down and the opponent can resolve whatever. So you also have access to Enlightened Tutor turn 1 into Rest in Peace on turn 2. You can just main deck 1 copy of Rest in Peace, and then your matchup against Jund and Mardu is significantly better. You can very consistently get Rest in Peace down on turn 2, which massively shuts off their proactive game plan. Then once you already have High Noon in play, if you draw another Enlightened Tutor, if you have mana to spend a mana during your turn and still hold counterspells up, you can Enlighten Tutor for Standstill, and then have a counterspell up for the opponent's turn to counter whatever they play, and then cast Standstill during your turn, meaning even if you have nothing else, if the opponent plays something into Standstill, it cracks before the card resolves, meaning if you happen to draw into another counterspell, you can counter it. And then you can also run a 1 or something like Pinnacle Starcade, which is very good against Auras. It's basically a temporary lockdown that doesn't get rid of your own High Noon as well. So I really liked Enlightened Tutor to improve the proactive game plan of the deck, but like I said, with Dimir being one of the most popular decks, and it has felt like an impossible matchup for High Noon, I just don't think you can afford to run this. If Dimir suddenly fell off, or for example there was an enchantment you could tutor off Enlightened Tutor that was lights out in that matchup, then I'd be much more interested, but I haven't really been able to find one for yet. So the big risk with running this deck, in my opinion, is your Dimir matchup is so bad that you basically just have to pray you don't get paired into it for the whole qualifier, which is not that great, I don't think. The next up we got Yawgmoth. So if you're not familiar with this deck, it's built around the namesake card. You have a lot of acceleration to be able to cast it, and then a lot of cheap creatures to be able to sacrifice to the Yawgmoth to use it for value, or ideally you want to set it up alongside 2 Young Wolves and then a way to drain the opponent like a Marionette Apprentice. And then obviously you've got Green Sun Zenith and Chord of Calling to search for it. Again, not saying that all of these cards are 4-ofs. I'm sure it'd probably be 4 Zenith and some number of Chord, probably not all the way to the 4-of, but this is probably the archetype that I'm least educated to talk about right now. It's a deck I've played a lot with and against in the past, but I haven't played with or against it very much recently, but I do think it's still a viable deck that it's worth talking about. Now, in the current metagame, I do worry about its matchup against both Jund and Dimir, because I feel like having played against those sorts of cheap interactive decks in the past, it can follow a pretty common play pattern where they either counterspell or discard spell away your top end and leave you with a bunch of mana dorks just, knocking the top of your deck, hoping to draw a Yawgmoth or a way to tutor it, or they interrupt your early acceleration and then leave you stranded with expensive cards that you can't really use very efficiently. And I think that is likely to happen quite a lot against Jund and Dimir, which is my main worry with the deck and maybe why I haven't seen it as much recently. Not to mention, I think it also really struggles against decks boarding in sweepers, and like I said, Jeskai Azorius Control still seeing some play. Main deck Divine Purge is going to be brutal against decks like this as well. But I do wonder, again, it's not an idea I've tested, so if you're thinking about Yawg, this is maybe just an idea that you can try out yourself. But in the current metagame, with Dimir and Jund being very popular, I do wonder if Birthing Ritual and Grist in high numbers is the way to go, because I do feel like against Dimir specifically, Birthing Ritual is so difficult for them to deal with. If you can sneak this in underneath one of their counterspells, it is just going to take over the game. They have no good way of dealing with it. Same sort of thing against Jund. Obviously, they do have more answers. They've got Abrupt Decay, and especially Culling Ritual post-sideboard is going to be a brutal issue for the Birthing Ritual builds. But again, especially since the food chain ban, I don't expect many Jund builds to be maxing out on Abrupt Decay, especially in the main deck. And then Grist is another really good way to grind well against decks like Dimir and Jund. And obviously with Mana Dorks that you're going to be running alongside Badger Molcarb, you should be able to cast this pretty consistently on turn 2. You can find it off Ritual, you can find it off Zenith as well. So I do wonder if a more grindy build of Birthing Ritual that isn't so all in on, running Chord in addition to Zenith, maybe you run Ritual plus Zenith and 4 4 Grist, for example, that build seems like it would have a better chance against especially Dimir, maybe Jund as well. But again, this is mainly me theory crafting. If you're a Yawgmoth player and you've been trying it recently, definitely let me know in the comments how you felt the deck has been positioned. But I definitely did want to highlight it because it does feel like a relatively underplayed deck at the moment. Then next up we have Aquatic Subtlety combo. So this one, if you're not familiar with it, is basically a deck that is built around these 2 3-mana cards, Aquatic Subtlety and Necromancy, with the idea being we want to use Aquatic Subtlety in order to give it Evoke to Agent of Treachery or Atraxa, and then we can use Agent of Treachery to steal something or Atraxa to refuel our hand, and then Essence Flux enables us to bounce either of them, which is especially important for Atraxa because it enables us to keep the creature in play and get 2 triggers to refuel our hand. But it's also really solid with Agent of Treachery, allowing you to steal multiple things, get to keep the agent in play as well to potentially start drawing cards if you can then steal something else. Then we've got Necromancy as another way to bring both of these back. We have Psychic Frog and Tainted Indulgence as ways to discard them. I've seen quite a few builds recently not running Tainted Indulgence and also running 4 Necromancy, which seems incredibly greedy to me. Relying entirely on Psychic Frog to discard these seems like you're going to end up in a lot of spots where you just have Necromancy and no ways to use it unless the opponent hits one of these with a discard spell, which isn't really going to happen that consistently. And then outside of that, you got Ponder to find your pieces. I did initially have Thunder Trap Trainer in this slot to go alongside Essence Flux. In the current metagame where it's a lot more interactive, I do kind of see the argument now more for Quantum Riddler because you're more likely to be in situations where you're empty-handed, in which case Riddler is great to get you back in the game, and it pairs very well with Psychic Frog as more of a fair game plan. But I do think that just in terms of finding these for your turn 3 combo, you know, Thunder Trap Trainer is better in a proactive sense, but again, with counter spells and discard spells being everywhere, getting the turn 3 combo off isn't going to be that consistent right now into Jund and Dimir anyway. So anyway, that's the core of the deck. In terms of its positioning, I still kind of feel a similar way to I did when I did it in the Under the Meta video. This basically feels like it has similar Dimir tools to the Dimir Tempo deck, but when the opponent has counter spells and, you know, discard spells coming from Junds, it's a lot more difficult to get this off, right? I think in the interactive mirror matches, those decks that just have more interaction in the form of discard spells and counter spells in your Jund and your Dimir are likely to have an advantage over you because you have a lot of dead cards that don't work unless you can resolve your Aquatic Subtlety or Necromancy, whereas the opponent is just going to be pure interaction. So I feel like against Dimir and Jund, you do have a trickier time. But having said that, I do think the argument for running Aquatic in the qualifier would be that the type of decks that I keep suggesting people run to go over the top of them, Aquatic Subtlety can beat, right? If the opponent tries to run Devotion or Affinity or Eldrazi or, you know, Badgermole Cub or whatever the case may be, those proactive decks that can play through the discard spells or counter spells, they're going to really struggle to beat Atraxa. They're really going to struggle to beat Agent of Treachery stealing the most, best permanent early in the game as well. So I feel like Aquatic Subtlety is going to have a bad matchup into Dimir and Jund, but, you know, still you can sometimes win that matchup, right? If you, especially off the back of Necromancy, because this being instant speed, you can go Tainted Indulgence at instant speed, Necromancy at the end of the opponent's turn, and then if they have to tap out to counter that, you can then combo off. So you do still have a chance in those matchups, but you're unfavored. But if you're worried about those decks that naturally go over the top of Jund and Dimir, this sort of list gives you a better chance against those sorts of decks. So there is still an argument for running this if you're concerned about the more proactive decks, the more linear decks. But I think in general, this is going to have a hard time into the more interactive decks, if that makes sense. Then next up we got Ninjas, which is similar in a way to the Dimir deck, but you're basically trying to get a flyer down early or an unblockable creature like a Changing Outcast, then attack on turn 2 and ninjutsu in stuff like Silverfur Master, Moon Circuit Hacker, Yuriko, or Kaito. There are still some other options like Ingenious Infiltrator. You could even potentially run a more aggressive build with Lurrus if you wanted to just run the Lord effects alongside it, but it's basically a low to the ground aggressive deck that can ninjutsu in, get a ton of value and apply pressure very quickly. And you also do get some very nice cards that I think are well positioned. Again, Retrofitter Foundry very good in Dimir mirror matches because the opponent has a really tough time answering it, and this can help you grind into longer games. But my big issue with this sort of deck is for this deck to work efficiently, you really need your early creatures to survive, and that's fine if you have, you know, a 1-drop plus an Ornithopter or you know, multiple Ornithopters to tax the opponent's early spot removal, especially if you're going first. But if you just have one creature and the opponent kills it with a Fatal Push or they Thought Seize away your ninjutsu creature in your hand, it's very difficult to consistently beat those. So I feel like while the format is, you know, again, I expect, again, Dimir and Jund to be very popular decks, it's very difficult to consistently get your proactive game plan off against those decks. So for the most part, I feel like this deck isn't that well positioned right now, because I feel like Dimir is basically doing a very similar thing, but is way less vulnerable to early interaction, which I expect to be very popular. So again, I don't really see a good argument to running Ninjas just over regular Dimir Tempo, because they have very similar play styles, but regular Dimir is just way more resilient. So I can't really think of a good justification to run this right now at all. Again, I think the deck is still generically powerful, but it's just largely worse than Dimir Tempo in my opinion. Let me know in the comments if you can think of a good argument for it. And then finally, the last deck I'm going to briefly talk about is Valakut, which is a deck that was pretty popular around the time this card came out, but it has dropped off a lot recently. So if you're not familiar with the deck, it is built around Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, as the name suggests, and you basically want to accelerate a bunch of lands very quickly. You got Dryad of the Elysian Grove, which enables you to run less mountains, which is an issue in Historic where we don't have a bunch of fetch lands. Also enables you to scapeshift a lot earlier, and then you've got One Ring, Ice Till Explorer as other decent options. I'm still personally very high on Burgeoning, Mulch, Winding Way, and Oxivagonus as a little package as well, but in general, the deck has just really fallen off because you rely so much on your sorcery speed stuff resolving, which is very tricky to do in a field of Dimir and Jund again, right? Counter spells, discard spells, very good against you, especially counter spells, right? Because the issue is, if you're playing Jund against the Valakut deck, they can just draw a One Ring or Scapeshift off the top, which can single-handedly get them back into the game. But against a deck like Dimir, where they have a bunch of counter spells, right, they can shut off your early game plan and then shut you off the top by attacking it with Psychic Frog every single turn, keep drawing more counter spells, and then that is really lights out. So again, this is another deck that I just feel is really tricky to consistently get off their proactive game plan into a field of Dimir and Jund. So again, it's an interesting deck, but I think especially with Harbinger still seeing play out the sideboard sometimes, there's just so many weaknesses of this deck into the current field that I don't really recommend running any build of it, if that makes sense. So those are all the decks that I want to talk about in this video. There are some archetypes that I've deliberately left off because they're more fringe ones that I'm working on for the qualifier and I'm really excited about, and I've come up with some new innovations that I want to keep under wraps. And there's also some that I've forgotten about, and there's also some that I haven't really played with or against much, so I didn't really feel educated to talk about them. So you'll have to figure out which one's which yourself, but definitely let me know in the comments if you think there are any that I've left out, if you want my opinion on them, if there's any builds that I didn't talk about of the decks that I addressed that you think are new and interesting and could change some of the stuff I've talked about, and just in general what you think of the current metagame, what you're thinking of playing, and also if there's any questions you've got about any of the decks that I talked about, because obviously in videos like this I don't have hours and hours to talk about each deck, so if there's any specific questions you've got about any of the decks, especially if you're new to the format, definitely let me know in the comments and I'll try and answer everyone if I've got time. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.